In 2008, NHRA's National Dragster ran a poll asking fans to name their favorite race car ever. Over 12,000 people voted, and they could pick anything. Top fuel dragsters running in the fives, funny cars that had redefined the sport, pro stock machines with factory engineering departments behind them. The winner, by nearly 500 votes, was a 1941 Willys coupe that last ran competitively in 1967. The Stone, Woods, and Cook Swindler burned pump gas in an era of nitromethane. It came from a class NHRA had eliminated 36 years earlier. By every modern standard, it should have been a footnote. Hot Rod magazine had already called it the most famous drag car of all time back in 1982, and the Revell model kit sold over 3 million copies. But beating nitro cars in a popularity contest 4 decades after the class died points to something beyond simple nostalgia. Here's the question this video is really asking. Why do people still care about cars that were slower, more dangerous, and officially made obsolete? Gassers weren't killed by failure. They were made irrelevant by success. Funny cars did everything gassers did, only faster. Pro stock took their spot in the class hierarchy. By every competitive measure, gassers should have faded into the background of drag racing history. They didn't. In September 2024, Rock Falls Raceway set a 200-car limit for their Nostalgia Gasser event, and it sold out in 36 hours. The Southeast Gassers Association has over 140,000 followers on social media. Dedicated magazines, sold-out events, and waiting lists exist for a class that hasn't been official since 1972. To understand why these cars refuse to be forgotten, you need to understand what they actually were and what racing lost when they disappeared. Gasser's stance wasn't cosmetic. That nose-high configuration served a purpose. NHRA rules required the crankshaft centerline to sit no more than 24 inches from the ground, but if you wanted to run a supercharger, and by the early 60s you needed one to be competitive, you had to fit a blower and intake manifold on top of your engine. The only way to do that legally was to raise the front end. A straight front axle weighed less than independent suspension and kept the wheels aligned when the front end lifted. These cars lifted constantly. When a gasser launched, the front wheels came up, sometimes a few inches, sometimes bumper dragging. The straight axle meant that when those wheels came back down, they landed straight instead of pointing wherever the suspension geometry wanted to send them. Weight transfer mattered even more. Before M&H developed decent slicks, tire compounds were poor, and the only way to get traction was to physically move weight to the rear wheels at launch. A raised front end combined with the short wheelbase of a Willys or Anglia shifted the center of gravity backward. When you hit the throttle, the weight went where you needed it. The result was a car that looked like it was fighting physics, because it was. Hot Rod magazine described them as Toledo vibrators, 2,500 pounds with 100-inch wheelbases, about as stable as an atomic pile. By the mid-60s, the top A-gas supercharged cars were running 950s at 155 miles per hour on gasoline, low 9s at over 160 on alcohol. The magazine said they equaled the guardrail-to-guardrail action of the fuel altereds. These weren't controlled launches, they were controlled chaos. Wheel stands weren't occasional, they were signature behavior. The Stone, Woods, and Cook cars were famous for it. Charlie Hill and Porky Zartman's Filthy 40 was known for violent starting line antics, bumper-dragging launches that looked like the car was trying to flip over backward. And the drivers? You could see them working. Steering corrections, fighting wheel hop, body twist as the chassis flexed. Nothing was hidden behind aerodynamic bodywork or managed by computers. Ohio George Montgomery, 8-time NHRA national champion, remembered what it was like. The tires weren't very sticky, and the track surfaces were about as useful as polished marble. There was no such thing as track preparation save for a quick pass with a push broom to get the bigger debris off the surface. He also remembered the tracks themselves. I can't believe I survived those southern strips with the spectators standing mere inches from the action and those dark shutdown areas full of huge chuck holes. When things went wrong, and they went wrong regularly, everyone saw it. One period account describes watching a Willys take off from the line, front wheels floating, then wham, stopped and had to be towed off. Both the crank and the camshaft were hanging out the side of the block. At the 1964 Winter Nationals, Big John Mazmanian's candy apple red Willys, a 150-mile-per-hour car, went up in smoke just off the line. The breakage was public, the struggle was visible, and nothing about gasser racing could be hidden or sanitized.
The height of the gasser wars wasn't really about lap times, it was about personalities. Stone, Woods, and Cook versus Big John Mazmanian, California versus California, Iski Cams versus Ingle Cams. Two teams that genuinely did not like each other, racing twice a week for 7 months, taking out advertisements in drag news to talk trash between events. Tim Woods on how it started. John told us he was going to take over AGS, and I said, no, you aren't, and that led to the first letters. The Cam Wars turned technical competition into public grudge matches. Sample headlines from the period read, Big John all shook up over losing the big one to SWC, and who is the number 3 gas coupe in the nation, Ohio George or Big John? The rivalry peaked in early May 1964 at Lyons Dragster. Fred Stone had challenged Mazmanian to a put-up-or-shut-up match, best of 3. Round 1 went to Bones Bollag, driving Mazmanian's car, 991 to Doug Cook's 996, 0.05 of a second. Round 2 went to Cook when Bones red-lighted. Round 3 was the one that mattered. Contemporary accounts describe both Willys coupes leaving the line at the hint of green, side by side for every inch of the quarter mile. Less than 10 seconds later, Doug Cook crossed the finish line 0.06 of a second ahead of Bones, running 993 at 141 miles per hour. That was the apex, the race that people talked about, the matchup that justified all the trash talk in the magazines. Stone, Woods, and Cook ran 53 race dates between April and October of that year, roughly twice a week for 7 months. They needed 2 cars to handle the schedule. But what made that rivalry matter wasn't just the speed, it was who these people were. Tim Woods owned Woods Construction Company. He couldn't get motel rooms in Indianapolis because of his race. This was still Jim Crow America. So he rented houses in black neighborhoods and opened them up to any racer who needed a place to stay. Dick Gazan, a crew member, later said, I don't think there is a man in drag racing that deserves more respect than Tim. When most of the country was still segregated, Tim ran an integrated team and even hired me, a young Jewish kid from Boston, to help Doug Cook on tour. Doug Cook, known as Cookie, was the driver and tuner, white. Tim Woods and Fred Stone were black. Hot Rod described them as feared and respected because they adhered to the racer's silent mantra, the race is the most important thing, and these guys would race anybody. Leonard Woods Jr., Tim's son, remembered it this way. Drag racers are a warm group, but there were places where we couldn't go. But by and large, we had a great experience. The fans and promoters welcomed us, and we never had much of a problem. The key was, would they come and see you? They came. On the other side of the rivalry, Big John Mazmanian stood 6'5", Armenian-American, a Navy veteran who'd taken shrapnel at Leyte Gulf. His cars were candy apple red with chrome components and real gold leaf lettering. In September 1964, at Bakersfield's March meet, his Willys ran 977 at 149 miles per hour, the first stock-bodied car into the nines. Hot Rod put it on the cover. Ohio George came out of Dayton, working at the AC Delco plant, hand-fabricating his own supercharger setups by mating a Kragar manifold to a GMC blower with custom drive pulleys. He won the U.S. Nationals in 1959, 1960, 1961, and 1963, becoming the first driver to win more than once. By the time he was done, he had 8 national championships.
These weren't factory teams or corporate programs. These were men who built their own cars, solved their own problems, and showed up to race whoever was there. Ohio George on match racing. I always ran my car as a legal A-gas supercharged at those match races because I felt that was the way to get good at it. But some of the other fellas didn't, so I didn't do as well at the match races as I did at the nationals. Eventually, I started to win and they stopped coming to the nationals, saying, "Hell, I can't beat him cheating, how am I going to beat him legal?"
In 1967, Ohio George made a decision and switched from his famous 1933 Willys to a Mustang. His assessment was blunt. I've got to say, with its lower center of gravity, longer wheelbase, sleek aerodynamics, and improved coilover suspension, the Mustang drove like a Rolls-Royce compared to the Willys. I never drove the Willys again. One run convinced him. The longer wheelbase machine was infinitely safer than the crowd-pleasing Willys, faster too. That same year, Doug Cook's driving career ended in a crash at 180 miles per hour in Alton, Illinois. The Stone, Woods, and Cook partnership dissolved, and the team that had defined the gasser wars was done. In 1968, Big John Mazamanian quit gas classes entirely and moved to fuel funny cars. The funny car was the problem, or the solution, depending on how you looked at it. NHRA gave funny cars their own class in 1967, and these new machines did everything the blown gassers did, only faster. Modern bodies, longer wheelbases, more stability, better performance. Ohio George again. Some critics complained that my Mustang killed the gassers. That's not true. What killed the gasser was the funny car, plain and simple. The new breed of funny cars did the same thing our blown gassers did, only faster. Then came Pro Stock. Bill Jenkins won the first event at the 1970 Winter Nationals, running 998 at 139. Suddenly, there was a professional class for cars that looked like what people drove on the street, backed by factory engineering and factory money. The gasser classes bled out slowly. Ohio George remembered, "When I started attending the Nationals in the late 50s, there were over 40 cars in my class. By the early 70s, that was down to half a dozen." In 1972, NHRA administered what Hot Rod called the death knell. Gas classes were eliminated, survivors got absorbed into competition eliminator, and that, the magazine wrote, was all she wrote. Lyons Drag Strip, the track where Stone, Woods, and Cook had raced Mazamanian in that legendary 1964 showdown, closed on December 2, 1972. Junior Thompson won A-gas supercharged at the final race. The track and the class ended together. Hot Rod magazine, looking back in 1988, tried to explain what had happened. When the gassers tried to fight back by switching to Mustang, Camaro, or Corvette bodies, they appeared to the spectators as just slow, boring, straight-ahead funny cars. That's the key line: slow, boring, straight ahead. The gassers had never been straight ahead. They'd been guardrail to guardrail, wheel standing, lane changing, smoke trailing chaos. You watched a gasser run, and you saw the driver fighting the car every inch of the quarter mile. When they put modern bodies on them, that visual drama disappeared. The performance was still there. Ohio George's Mustang ran 8.7s in 1968, faster than anything the Willys had ever done. But nobody talks about the Mustang. When Ohio George died in August 2023 at 90 years old, the obituaries led with the Willys. The car he'd stopped driving in 1967 defined his legacy more than everything that came after. Doug Cook revealed something years later that explains part of why he was so successful. "I didn't really have any secrets as such, except I was a hair smarter than the other guys in one respect. I put a positraction rear end under the car, while all the others had spools and live axles." He explained what that meant. If you staged slightly crooked or hit a little something, it pushed the front end wherever it wanted to go. But a Willys with a positraction would go right on down the road. That's why in all these years you never saw it sideways.
a technical advantage, a competitive edge. But notice what he's describing, the constant battle with instability. The other cars went sideways, the front ends went wherever they wanted. Cook's innovation was that his car went straight. That was the baseline, and that was what distinguished a winning gasser from the rest of the field. Modern racing solved these problems with longer wheelbases, better suspension, proper aerodynamics, traction control, and data acquisition. The cars got faster, safer, and more consistent. They also got harder to tell apart. A fan in the stands at a pro stock race watches two nearly identical cars make nearly identical runs. The winner is determined by hundredths of a second, by details invisible to the naked eye. It's better racing by every objective measure, and it's also racing that requires a television broadcast and slow-motion replay to fully appreciate. Gassers you could see. You could watch them struggle, watch them almost lose control, watch the driver sawing at the wheel, fighting the car, working for every tenth of a second. And here's the other thing. They looked like something a person could build. Even the best-funded gassers, like Mazamanian's candy red Willys with the gold leaf lettering, still looked like garage cars. They had Halabrand wheels and moon tanks and fender well headers and stripped interiors. They had hand-lettered names and visible welds and homemade solutions to homemade problems. Ohio George fabricated his own supercharger setup. Doug Cook figured out the positaction advantage on his own. Tim Woods ran a construction company and funded a race team on the side. These weren't corporate programs with engineering departments and PR firms. These were people who loved racing, built their own stuff, and showed up to compete. That's the emotional access point. Someone watching in 1964 could look at a Stone, Woods, and Cook Willys and think they could do that. Not easily, not cheaply, but theoretically, a person with a garage and determination could build something competitive. Try thinking that about a modern top-fuel dragster.
Sometime in the late 1980s, the nostalgia movement started. The Good Guys Rod and Custom Association helped drive it, and groups like the Geezer Gassers formed, trademarking the name in 2002. Nostalgia Superstock, Inc. was established in 1989 and claims to be the oldest organization promoting heads-up exhibition racing for vintage machinery. The first California Hot Rod Reunion ran in 1992 and drew nearly 10,000 spectators. By 2014, that number was 35,000. Today, multiple organizations run gasser events. The Southeast Gassers Association has a 10-race schedule for 2026. The Nostalgia Gassers Racing Association operates in the Midwest. NHRA's Hot Rod Heritage Series runs 11 events a year, with A-Gas through D-Gas classes. Rock Falls Raceway's Fallout sells out its 200-car limit in 36 hours. The original Stone, Woods, and Cook Swindler A sits permanently displayed at the Wally Parks NHRA Motorsports Museum in Pomona. When original gasser-style cars come for sale, they sell. A 1941 Willys gasser brought $176,000 at Mecum, Monterey in August 2023. Another sold for $76,000 on Bring a Trailer in November 2024. Tribute builds go for $30,000 to $75,000, and originals with documented history can push past $200,000. In 2025, the NDRL announced they're adding a Nostalgia Superstock class, with Nostalgia Gassers coming in 2026. 54 years after NHRA eliminated the class, organizations are still creating new venues for these cars to run. So why do people still care about cars that were slower, dangerous, and officially obsolete by 1972? The usual answer is nostalgia. People remember what they loved when they were young and they want to experience it again. That's true, but it's not the whole story. Nostalgia doesn't explain why a gasser beat nitro dragsters in a popularity contest. It doesn't explain waiting lists for events featuring a 50-year-old class. It doesn't explain over 140,000 people following a regional racing association on social media.
The deeper answer is that gassers represent something that professional racing traded away. Ohio George, talking about surviving the gasser era. I guess good drivers survive, and we all survived the gasser wars. He's talking about danger, but he's also talking about something else. He's talking about an era when racing was personal, when you could see the driver working, when the cars looked like somebody built them, when the competition was between individuals rather than programs. Modern drag racing is better in almost every measurable way. It's faster, safer, more consistent, more professional. The engineering is extraordinary, and the performance is beyond what anyone in 1964 could have imagined. But something got lost in the transaction. Call it character, call it chaos, call it the visible struggle of a human being fighting a machine that wants to go sideways. Tim Woods once said about Doug Cook, "I'd hate to belittle my other drivers, but there was only one Doug Cook." There was only one gasser era, too. A brief window when hand-built cars driven by independent racers could compete at the national level against anyone, when the racing was as much about personality as performance, when you could stand at the fence and watch a driver earn every inch of the quarter mile. The class died in 1972. The feeling never did. The Stone, Woods, and Cook Willys sits in a museum now, the original car that Hot Rod called the most famous drag car of all time, the car that 12,000 fans voted their favorite ever in 2008. Doug Cook died in 1999, Tim Woods in 1995, Fred Stone in 1982, Ohio George in 2023, Big John Mazmanian in 2006. The people who built these cars, who drove them, who made them legends, are almost all gone now. But the cars keep running. New events every year, waiting lists to enter, crowds that come out to see machines that stopped being competitive before some of those spectators were born. If you were at Lions when Stone, Woods, and Cook raced Mazmanian, that memory is worth more than anything in this video. If you turned wrenches on a gasser in the 60s, you know things that never got written down. Drop it in the comments, not for me, for the record, because the people who were there are the real source, and that window is closing.